Let's say you wanted to find a creative person. What would you look for? How could you find a creative person? Is it their personality? Is it something genetic? Is it something in their behavior? And so this is a really interesting question. And it's been a question that psychologists have studied for a long time. In general, common wisdom and early research suggested that creatively performing individuals, that is people who are able to do creative tasks, they tend to have broad interests, they tend to seek complexity, that they're looking for more complex things, they're intuitive, they can work off their gut, they're aesthetically sensitive, they're ambiguity tolerant, and they're also self-confident. And these are the kind of the features that are part of what a individual will have. There's a question of whether creative individuals are born or made. The kind of things I just talked about, these kind of things that we just talked about, are not personality traits. They're not actually a part of your personality. The personality being the thing that then stays stable over time. So if I measure you today and I measure you tomorrow or a year from now, that you would be measured the same on those traits. And those traits, aesthetic sensitivity, is not something that psychologists call a personality trait. And so despite 100 years of study, there's not really been a great finding, that is, we're not absolutely certain that there's this thing called a creative personality. In fact, we're pretty certain that there's not a thing called a creative personality. And so what about that? I want to think about that. Personality, for psychologists, personality is defined into these sort of 5 personality traits. One is agreeableness, to what extent you go along with others and you get along with others. Extroversion, extrovertly oriented, to the extent that you bring you gain energy from the outside. Neuroticism, to what extent you worry and that you're nervous about things. Conscientiousness, that sort of follow through, persistence, and openness. To what extent are you open to new experiences? And so among these big 5, there's not one called creative or creativity. Although you may have some suspicion that some of these are related to creativity, in fact. Well, here's a chart that shows a study that was done. And the study basically had people, it measured part of their personality, and then had them do a creative task. And so what they tried to do was say, is that element of your personality related to your ability to do creative tasks? Remember, there are these 5 things that are there, these 5 possibilities for what drives creativity. And so we can see here that agreeableness, to what extent they were agreeable, had no correlation. This is a correlation chart, had no correlation with creative output. So that is to say, if someone was very high in agreeableness, as based on the personality test, it did not matter if they were high or low with respect to how much creative output they had. The second one does have some correlation. And so we can see here that at 0.12, somewhere in there, that extroversion actually does seem to have some correlation with creative output. So people who are more extroverted tend to have a little bit more creative output. Next we see neuroticism. Neuroticism is negatively correlated with creative output. Why would that be? Well, maybe it's because, we'll go ahead and think about it for a moment. Maybe it's because people were worried about the experiment, they were worried about other people. When we were trying to do something creative, we're sort of constantly second-guessing ourselves, and that would make us a little bit less creative. Then we have this conscientiousness. It seems pretty high, actually. The conscientiousness, the follow-through, the persistence seem to have a fair amount more of correlation with creative output. And then also openness. So it looks like of the 5 personality traits, we have 3 of them that are actually somewhat correlated with creative output. The only problem is that these correlations are not very strong. And so if you know statistics, and if you go into statistics and do this kind of research, you'll see that R squared of 0.1, right, where you see where 0.1 is barely significant. It's really barely above the level of noise. And so although there's something here, it's not very strong. And so it really doesn't tell us what the secret is to make a person creative. Let me add one column in this chart. So again, when the researchers did this study, they measured people based on these personality traits, and they also added another measure. And this measure was called cognitive ability, the thing we call IQ, basically how smart they are as far as we measure those. And all of a sudden we see a much larger correlation. So being smart actually is more important than being neurotic, than being open, than being extroverted, than being all these other things with respect to creative output. Isn't that interesting? So there's something that we possibly can do. But can we change our smartness? Can we change what our IQ is? Well, I think at least creativity, we don't want to say that creativity is an attribute of our personality. in any kind of technical sense, right? So there's not a thing in the way that personality is measured by psychologists that creative is part of that. What we want to do is think about another way of thinking about it. What research suggests is that the way that we think, the habits of perception, how it is we bring information into our brain, how it is we think different thoughts. So remember, IQ was correlated, and so IQ maybe has something to do with that. And specifically, what it is that the power to be creative is going to come down to three basic things. Perception. So perception is about getting information in, that if I want to have ideas, that's on the basis of something. We call that that data, that information. And so perception is the most important thing to get information in. Once I have the information in, I have to think about it. I have to put it together in different ways and say, oh, I saw this here and I saw that there. How do I bring them together into a new idea? So thinking is a part of it also. Then finally, an idea does no good in your head and it has to come out. And that's what we're going to call expression. How do I get my ideas out of my head? And without being able to bring information in, without thinking about things in a different way, and without expressing our ideas, we're not going to get to a new place. And so what we want to think about is what can go wrong in each of these and how it is that we can sort of protect ourselves against things going wrong in each of these cases. So here's a picture of the model and how we're going to think about it. Perception, bringing information in. Intellection, how we think things through. And expression, how it is we put our ideas back out into the world for other people to see, to judge, and to test. At this point, I'd like to go in a little bit more detail in perception. Let's think about perception, about bringing information in and what's involved in that. Because again, if you can't bring information in, you're not going to be able to have new ideas. There are at least three, there are many, many, many issues in perception, but let me just talk about three of them. I want to talk about, actually there's four of them I want to talk about. I want to talk about selective perception, that is when we choose what to pay attention to in a suboptimal way, we choose what to pay attention to in a way that does not help us become more innovative. Stereotyping. Stereotyping is when we use a shorthand, when we make a reference to something without really thinking through what it is, without really seeing. We do limited data gathering. Oftentimes we won't gather all the data we possibly could. We can't bring the data in. And also the distance that we are from the data. The data, maybe we're too close to it or we're too far away from the problem. We probably have all experienced that when you're too close to the problem, it's really difficult to see beyond that. Or if you're too far away, you don't have the details you need to see it. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Perception is about looking without seeing. And I think sort of this idea of being able to see what's really there and bring it into our brain so that we can actually use it as a basis of new ideas. Take a look at an image like this. This kind of image is an optical illusion, and it may be that it's something that looks like it's moving when it's really not moving. We've all seen all kinds of optical illusions, the way things change shape. That has to do with actually the physical apparatus that we use to perceive things. How do we get things in? Take a look at this. Because of the way this pattern is, if you try to count the black dots, just standing close to this and you can see the black dots, that your eye, because of the contrast between the little squares there, it looks like there's a black dot, but when you look at it, it goes away. That's again because of the physical apparatus, the way that our brain and our eye optic nerves are designed and the way that we do looking for edges inside of our brain, we have no control over it. It causes us to not be able to see certain things or to be able to see things that are not there. And so again, that's how perception matters. We get selective with our perception when we actually start to only consider the rough outlines of something. This is sort of something in a very basic level without really understanding or without really going into a little bit more depth of what it is. Let me tell you about this a little bit more clearly now. So if you take a look at a picture like this is the human body drawn with the body part size drawn with in proportion to how many nerve endings, how many touch nerve endings go to your brain from that part. Look how big our thumbs are. Our thumbs are gigantic. That is, there's lots and lots and lots of neural endings from our thumbs that go to our brain. These fingers here, the two fingers in the middle, that's why it's hard to do the Spock thing. See if you can do that. It's kind of difficult to do because of the smaller number of neural endings there. And so you can see that in the pictures. It's pretty clear. Our big toes, very important. We need our big toes for balance. So when we're walking, we actually use our big toes. Our face is very sensitive. You look at our face, you can tell about 1/4 degree temperature difference with our face just because of the neural endings there. And so what this suggests is that we bring in information, even at a very physiological level, differentially. That is, we bring in more information from some parts of our body than other information, than other parts of our body. I mean, think about this. When's the last time you thought about your big toe? Maybe it's the last time you stubbed it. Nonetheless, that is the kind of information that we might want if we were designing a pair of shoes, for example. So if we're not thinking about our feet, we're not going to come up with good ideas about toes. And the perception is there, we're just not, I mean, the sensation is there, the physical stimulus is there, we're just not paying attention to it. There's an argument that we learn through the body, and here's a picture of a little statue I saw in Switzerland at this Museum of the Hand. And this statue depicts how we bring in information, that is what parts of our body we learn the most from. So if you took a person from 0 years old until they were 25 years old, the way that they learn through the body is a lot through the hands. We're always touching things. Notice the size of the mouth also, that we're always putting things into our mouth, and that's something that allows us to learn. That is, we're putting things in our mouth when we're young children. So young children, immediately everything goes in the mouth, and that's how they learn about the world in there. Eyes are much smaller than we would give them credit for being. Sure, we learn a lot from that. We learn a lot from reading and from seeing and from looking around, but if you think of over the lifespan of how much we've learned as from being a baby, from being a helpless baby, all the way up till growing up, we learned a lot more at a much higher rate when we were young than we do now, notwithstanding this class. So when we think about pattern finding or stereotyping, what we do is we routinely ignore, just because of the cognitive limits of the brain, we routinely ignore things that are there, that are actually there. For example, you might go into a room and you look around and you see a window, you see a chair, you see a thing, and we're really not sort of taking apart those sensations. We're not really looking at it. And so I say, oh, that's an ugly lamp, without really sort of looking at it and sort of trying to understand what is it about that lamp. And I have to do that because every time I walked into a new space, if I were to take apart each little thing, oh, there's this and there's a little light bulb and there's a piece above there and there's a piece under there, I would be debilitated. I would not be able to move on in my life. But the chances that I want to, when it matters is when we want to pay attention to those things. If I'm going to design a new chair, design a new lamp, then I want to be able to look at a lamp and take it apart and really understand what it is in there. That is, take it apart in my mind. So let's take a little exercise here. What I'd like you to do is to draw a bicycle. So go ahead and just take a moment, the video will pause here, and just draw a picture of a bicycle. After you're done, come back. This really simple sketch just take a minute at most to draw a bicycle. Did your bicycle look anything like these bicycles here? Probably a fairly normal bicycle, one like this or a bicycle like this. Those bicycles are the stereotypes of bicycles. But what about these other kinds of bicycles here, a recumbent bicycle or this little hot rod chopper down here? How are they different than normal bicycles? And if you look at them, it's actually kind of interesting. One of these bicycles, if bicycles, we assume that the wheels are the same size in the front as in the rear. And these sort of weird bicycles seem to violate that. Also, we generally think of a bicycle as you sit up on a seat and you push down with your feet on the pedals and you're using gravity to stay on board the bicycle. These violate that. One of these even has a steering wheel instead of a handlebar, and that really is unbicycle-like. Now, it's important to know to have a stereotype of a bicycle. Say, for example, I'm walking along with my friend and there's something coming. I say, oh, hey, Stephen, there's this thing coming. It's got like two big round wheels, and the guy's sitting up on top, and he's pushed. By the time I explained what a bicycle was, my friend would be run over by that bicycle. Instead, I say, hey, Stephen, a bike, and we jump out of the way. But if I were going to start a bicycle business with Stephen, that would be really different. In that case, I'd really want to take apart what a bicycle is. What are the assumptions that we make about a bicycle and how it is that a bicycle works and why it is that a bicycle is shaped the way it is. Is it shaped because of the way history's made it that way, or is it shaped for some other reason? So again, we're taking apart this idea of what the thing is and breaking it into constituent components. We're not just operating off a stereotype of what that thing is. A chair? Go ahead and see if you can draw a chair. Do the same exercise and draw a chair. And I'll show you some other chairs that you might not have come to. But think about it. What is a chair? A chair is a flat surface that you sit on, or is it more than that? So here's a number of chairs that violate the sense of chairness, to more or less. And again, if you just want to sit down, using your stereotype of a chair is enough. Does it have a flat surface that will hold my weight? It's a chair. However, if you're going to think about chairs in a new way, then we need to sort of stop and sort of take apart what are the assumptions that we make about chairs from a purely sort of stereotypical perspective. So this pattern finding or the stereotyping is necessary, and it helps us, but also gets in the way. Because we couldn't get through life unless we basically made shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts for things, but also that it would be very difficult for us to get to a new place unless we sort of stopped and took things apart in our mind. Another thing we do among these constraints of perception, we limit the universe of relevant data. There's data out there and we don't take it in. So again, there's this thing about stereotyping, which is a shorthand for bringing information in. When it's time to go out and look for data that would apply to the problem that we're doing, sometimes we just would begin to take shortcuts. Maybe we're too lazy, cognitively lazy, or even physically lazy to go out and gather the information. What we tend to do is gather information from the places that we've gathered it from before. So if I'm used to Googling something and to find information, then I'll tend to Google it in the future. And if it works for me, I'm especially likely to go back and do it in the same exact way. So if my boss, my supervisor, has asked me to gather some data to make some decision, and I gather it once that way and it works, then I'll try to gather it that way again. Because that way I avoid new search costs, that way I'm more certain that it's going to be correct data in that way. But if we want to get somewhere new, we're going to need different data, right? We have to find our relevant data in somewhere else, somewhere that we look. Let me show you a little piece of video here. You may have to click the video, but watch what happens as this unsuspecting pedestrian gives directions to someone. Isn't that interesting? 50% of the people in the study did not notice that the person had been switched, that the person giving directions had been switched. Why is that? One thing is, people are really busy. That when we get really busy, we get engrossed in something, we don't notice what's going on around us. And so that's this kind of selective perception. That's just only paying attention to the one thing we want. That's fine, right? Because does it matter that a different person's there when we're focused on giving directions? It may not matter. There are times when we're really busy when we just need to get something done. However, if we're too busy to look when we're actually trying to do innovation, that is when we're seeking new things, we're trying to innovate, we have to pay attention. It's much more difficult to get somewhere new if we're not paying attention. And the problem is, many of us lead overscheduled lives, we're very busy at work, we're overworked, we feel like we're doing two people's jobs, and so how can we possibly peel away the time to just sort of sit back and really pay attention and not be focused and busy on our work that we do on a daily basis? Here's a telephone keypad. I'm sure you've seen one of these things many, many, many times. What I'd like you to do is see if you can fill in the numbers and the letters that go with the keys in the arrangement here. So hopefully you've seen one of these before, and if not, don't worry, but see if you can put in the numbers where they go and the letters where they go. What's hard about this is that we've seen this thing so many times that our brain has realized, why do I need to remember this? I can just look it up when I need it. And so what we'll do is we'll look up the keys when we need it. So I'm trying to make a phone call, I see some numbers and letters, I'll just go ahead and see them right there. I don't have to commit that to memory. And so again, that's just one of these kind of shortcuts that I may take to help my brain actually get through the day without overheating. So remember when Art Fry was asked to gather data for the Post-it note, that is when they were going to do a market study, they kept going to the market study, doing a market study in the same way they had done them before, the way that 3M had traditionally done market studies. It was only when they changed the way they gathered data, that is the way they did the market study, that the new data was able to be meaningful for that. And so the old way that they were doing things was not going to work for this new kind of product. And that's the kind of warning or cautionary tale that we want to take out of that. And so the data that we try to get hold of could also be affected by the organizations that we're part of. In some organizations, for example, you're not allowed to have certain kinds of data because it's considered proprietary, it's considered secret. You may be that someone's worried that you'll give this to competitors, and so we may not get the data that we need to make market study decisions or other kinds of decisions that really affect our organization. And so again, being persistent about gathering the data, I think, is a really important thing that we'll want to do. Another problem we have, we don't get close to the data. And so if you take a picture like this and ask, what is this picture? It's really hard to say. However, now, if we back off of this picture and look from a little bit farther away, you can see what it is. And so I'm using this sort of as almost as a metaphor to say sometimes we're so close to the problem, it's really difficult to see what it is. And in a related way, we may be too far away from the problem that we're looking at to be able to see the data for what it really is. So these perception constraints. So these are the four perception constraints we've talked about. Selective perception, only looking at certain things, only bringing in information because that's how we bring it in. Stereotyping, using the shorthand method for talking about things. The limited data gathering, not going and finding information because we're not allowed to or because it's not convenient. And then also the distance from the data, how close it is we can be to the data. So how do you overcome? If you're going to overcome these constraints, how do we overcome them? Because again, the problem of innovation, the problem of having good ideas starts with the base information that we brought in, the perceptions that we brought in. So if we're going to have good perceptions, we need to overcome these things. How do we do that? Well, we find more sources of data. That's a pretty simple one, right? Find a source list, for example, if you have a project that you're working on, write down a list of all the sources of information that you could possibly imagine getting. And again, you're going to use your good brainstorm technique to get those. Use your strategies for brainstorming. Get a big long list of all the sources of data that you're going to use for a project, and then come back to it later and say, did I use all those sources of data? Did I go to all those sources of data? So if I have 10 sources of data, I'll talk to my boss and I'll look at my competitors and I'll benchmark this and I'll find someone else who's done this, and then I'll look in Google and I'll look at this other place and look at all these other places. Once I have my ideas, I can go back to this list and say, well, have I looked everywhere I possibly could? It's a pretty simple step, and a lot of us don't do it. Another thing we can do is we can use this sort of what I call practice empathy. That is, imagine how other people perceive this problem. Get into their shoes. How is it like as a kid? How would it be like as a director? How would it be like as a person? So I have a friend, an acquaintance who was a playwright. So she would write plays. She was interested in writing a play from a young boy's perspective, and that might be hard for an adult woman to write a play from a young boy's perspective. But what she did was she went out and got a bunch of skateboard magazines and magazines that were obviously pointed at young boys, and began to look through those and try to understand how things were. What was the language that they used? What are the things they're interested in? What kind of ads are they are pointed at them, and how do those things look? And that gave her lots more information, a lot more data about how it is that a young boy would behave and how it is that a young boy would feel. And so this kind of empathy that she practiced was a great way, I believe, to practice that kind of empathy. Another thing we can do is we can enrich the input. The more sources of data that we have as input, the better off we are. Think about starting with your workspace, the environment within which you work. If you walk around your office and you see things that other people have at their desks, does that serve as data? In the product development company IDEO, people have all their different junk, the projects they've worked on in the past, inside their cubicle or inside the little office where they work. And as you walk around, you can see, oh, that guy worked on some food, and that guy worked on a scuba gear, and that guy worked on a fishing rod. And that tells us something about them. Not only does it stimulate our own information, our own perception, that we're seeing things again, but it also advertises to other people what they know. And so it's also important for me to know the things, but it's also important for me to know who knows. So if I'm going to work on a project for scuba diving equipment, I can just go find the person who worked on scuba diving because I can see that stuff. Or I can go to the scuba diving store and learn from those people there. So again, if we can advertise to other people what we're interested in and what we know, that could be another source of good input for us as we go forward. So next we're going to talk about intellection constraints, the thinking constraints that go on.